Hi, like and subscribe for the more true stories. In some ways, it is terrifying to imagine just how close the town of Marchington came to obliteration by the tentacles of a demonic cephalopod. The end. It was finished. Months of toil had finally given way to Marty's latest masterpiece. Of his 18 novels to date, this was to be his finest. If 80,000 words detailing the horrific exploits of a demonic octopus residing in a quiet, seaside aquarium didn't announce the arrival of Martin Murderstorm, his pen name of choice, on the international horror stage, then he was convinced that nothing would. Old One Offspring was to be his magnum opus. Of course, Marty had held the same belief upon completion of his previous 17 self-published novels. His bestseller to date, the aptly titled Number Cruncher, a story about a murderer who only targeted chartered accountants, had sold 6 copies. The rest of his back catalog had not fared nearly so well, yet Marty's belief in his work never faltered. Though his girlfriend had left him, and his parents had kicked him out of their basement, still he clung to the dream of one day becoming a best-selling horror author. He checked his watch. 1:23 a.m. Just enough time to fire out a few quick emails to the agents that had taken the time to reject his previous works. He loaded up his usual email template and set to work. Dear, insert name here. My name is Martin Murderstorm, and I am the savior of horror. Don't believe me? Then treat your eyes to insert title here, which is my latest tale of dread. It's about, enter spine-chilling description here, and it will blow your mind. I hope that we can work together. Yours confidently, Martin Murderstorm, Visionary. With all 32 of his agent contacts emailed, Marty closed the laptop, fixed himself a glass of warm milk, and climbed into his single bed. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. On opening his inbox the following morning, Marty was greeted with 32 emails, all of which said the same thing. Thanks, but no thanks. He sat for a while, blinking at the screen, unable to process what he was seeing. He'd received rejections before, and plenty of them, but they were in regards to inferior pieces. Old One Offspring was too damn good to be rejected out of hand. He wondered whether they had even gotten past the front cover, which featured an illustrated octopus brooding in its tank as couples and children pass it by, oblivious to the terror contained behind the inch of reinforced glass. No, he thought to himself, there is no way any of them even read it, not that quickly. As he munched his way through a half bowl of cornflakes, he worked out the beginnings of Plan B. This book deserved to be read, and by God, was he ever going to do whatever it took to get it noticed? It was time for a change of tact. Every approach he had previously made had been via email. This was the industry norm. Agents expected as such. But Marty felt that perhaps this was a tad impersonal. Each of his rejection emails contained the direct phone number to the agent disregarding his work. Marty's plan was simple. He was to choose the agency he most liked the sound of, and he'd speak to them directly. After much pondering, he decided upon McCluster and Luster, as it was the name that he liked the best, and dialed their head office. "Good morning, McCluster and Luster," said a cheery female voice on the other end of the phone. "Ruth speaking. How may I direct your call?" Marty took a deep breath. "Good morning, Ruth. I was wondering, could I speak to Mr. McCluster, please? Or Mr. Luster? I don't mind which one, really. Whoever is free will do." "That won't be possible, I'm afraid. Mr. McCluster died of polio in 1928. and Mr. Luster fell from a train in 1935. They founded the company in 1919. They don't actually work here." "Ah," gulped Marty. "It didn't say that on the website." "No, it probably doesn't. I doubt many companies include the details of their founders' deaths as part of their online information." "Some would deem the approach distasteful," replied Ruth, some of her initial cheeriness lost. "Is there anybody else that you might wish to speak to?" Yes. Bear with me 2 seconds." Marty scrolled through his emails until he located the one needed. "Could you pass me through to Mr. Alan Chambers then, please? And who shall I say is calling?" "Martin Murderstorm." The sound of a muffled laugh quickly cut into the jazz piece that the company had chosen as its hold music. After a minute of lazy snares and wailing saxophones, Alan Chambers spoke. "Hello, Mr. Murderstorm." He sounded weary and in desperate need of coffee. "Yes, that's me. Thank you for taking my call. Good morning." "What is it that you want?" interrupted Alan. "I've a busy morning ahead, and I'd prefer if we cut directly to the chase." "Certainly, of course. It's about my book, Old One Offspring." "Ah, yes," sighed Alan. "The Possessed Octopus. You read it? Wait, he wasn't possessed. He was the son of... I read the blurb and decided to pass. Look, the truth is, we have far too many authors like you on our books anyway. We simply don't have the time or resources to pick up another writer." Marty had been prepared for this response, as it was the one that cropped up most regularly in his email rejections. "If you ask me, this seems to be an issue with all agents, don't you think? Tell me, if you always have full lists, then how does somebody new get onto your books?" The line fell silent for a moment as Alan pondered how best to answer. "Well, I imagine that when one of our authors retires from writing, that potentially frees up space for somebody new. In theory, anyway." Marty's eyes widened. "That's all I needed to know, Mr. Chambers. Thank you for your time." "No prob..." Marty slammed the phone down and turned to his laptop. He clicked on the list of clients that McCluster and Luster represented and began to read. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Clarice Huntington closed the front cover and handed the book back to the elderly lady who stood in front of her. The book signing had seen a poor turnout, and although Checkley was her hometown, she had lowered her expectations accordingly. Now in the twilight of her career, and with nearly 30 books on horticulture to her name, the longest-serving author on McCluster and Luster's books was bored. Her passion for writing had withered long ago, and the draw of her celebrity as a local artist had started to wane. "There you go, and thank you for coming in to see me today. I appreciate you making the journey out." "Oh, it's no bother," replied the woman who had given her name as Ethel. "I was in town anyway. I had to get some milk, and I saw your sign in the window. I didn't even know who you were until I saw your picture. I have read all of your books at one time or another. Tell me, which perennials can I plant in the shade? All the ones I try seem to need sun." Clarice rubbed her temples. This was a question that she was asked on an almost daily basis, and one she answered in every book. "Chapter 4 will sort that little quandary out for you," said Clarice with a forced smile. "And slugs? I'm forever battling with slugs." "Chapter 8 for slugs." Ethel thanked her once again and waddled out into the high street, leaving Clarice, the bookstore attendant, and the young man who had spent the last half hour flicking through her back catalog, alone in the bookstore. "Can I sign one of those for you?" offered Clarice. The man placed the book that he was reading back onto the bookshelf and hurried out of the door. I'll take that as a no, then. Clarice took a sip from her silver hip flask and returned her attention to her crossword puzzle. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. It was raining by the time Clarice had packed her unsold copies of Great Flowers of England into her wheeled trolley and started the walk home. She vowed to herself that she would not attend any more book signings and would push any future sales online. She had seen the lines to meet her gradually dwindle into nothing, and this had slowly chipped away at both her desire to write and her self-confidence. As the rain fell harder, she quickened her pace across the cobbled streets, the squeak of her trolley wheels drowning out the sound of the footsteps that followed quickly behind her. She had not long taken off her coat when Clarice heard the knock on the door. Stood before her, sodden with rain, was the man who had fled the bookstore earlier. He smiled at her. Clarice Huntington? Yes, but I don't do doorstep signings, Sonny. I asked you earlier and... I need your slot, said the man. You need my slot? Repeated Clarice, confused. Yes, said the man with a smile. Then, in one smooth movement, the man took a pistol from his pocket and shot Clarice in the face. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. Clarice rubbed her temples. This was a question that she was asked on an almost daily basis, and one she answered in every book. Chapter 4 will sort that little quandary out for you, said Clarice with a forced smile. And slugs? I'm forever battling with slugs. Chapter 8 for slugs. Ethel thanked her once again and waddled out into the high street, leaving Clarice, the bookstore attendant, and the young man who had spent the last half hour flicking through her back catalog, alone in the bookstore. Can I sign one of those for you? Offered Clarice. The man placed the book that he was reading back onto the bookshelf and hurried out of the door. I'll take that as a no, then. Clarice took a sip from her silver hip flask and returned her attention to her crossword puzzle. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. It was raining by the time Clarice had packed her unsold copies of Great Flowers of England into her wheeled trolley and started the walk home. She vowed to herself that she would not attend any more book signings and would push any future sales online. She had seen the lines to meet her gradually dwindle into nothing, and this had slowly chipped away at both her desire to write and her self-confidence. As the rain fell harder, she quickened her pace across the cobbled streets, the squeak of her trolley wheels drowning out the sound of the footsteps that followed quickly behind her. She had not long taken off her coat when Clarice heard the knock on the door. Stood before her, sodden with rain, was the man who had fled the bookstore earlier. He smiled at her. Clarice Huntington? Yes, but I don't do doorstep signings, Sonny. I asked you earlier and... I need your slot, said the man. You need my slot? Repeated Clarice, confused. Yes, said the man with a smile. Then, in one smooth movement, the man took a pistol from his pocket and shot Clarice in the face. Asterisk, 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 asterisk. The phone was answered within 3 rings. Alan Chambers. Hi, Alan. It's Marty. How's it going? Marty? Replied Alan as he moved to hang up. I don't recall anyone by that name. Sorry. Marty Murderstorm, the author of Old One Offspring. Listen. Ah, Mr. Murderstorm, sighed Alan, suddenly disinterested. I heard about Clarice Huntington, began Marty. Terrible business. Ah, yes. Yes, it was. We are all deeply saddened by her untimely death. To be gunned down on her doorstep like that. Awful, just awful, continued Marty. What was it? A gang hit? What? I mean, you hear about them all the time? Who knows what she was into, who she owed money to? Of course it wasn't a gang hit, replied Alan. She wrote books on bloody shrubs. Hardly the type to be linked to hardened criminals. Look, is there a point to this call? Marty smiled. Straight to business. He liked that quality in Alan. Yes, of course. Well, I was wondering, now you are an author light, perhaps you'd have space to add me to your roster. There followed a long and uneasy silence before Alan finally spoke. Mr. Murderstorm, I hardly think that now is the appropriate time to discuss such matters, do you? One of our longest-serving authors. The longest-serving, interrupted Marty. The longest-serving author on our books was murdered in cold blood. Any notion of replacing her is so far removed from my mind as to be unimaginable. Now, if you will excuse me. The line went dead, and Marty hung up. It seemed to him that the shock of losing one author was not going to be enough for him to force his claim to be added to their client list, and that further culling was to be required. Over the following months, the client list of McCluster and Luster decreased by a further 12 as more authors continued to turn up dead. There was the award-winning crime novelist Horace Witter, whose car had left the road at high speed and ended up at the bottom of a ravine. Romance writer Carol Shucker was found crumpled at the bottom of a public stairwell, her neck broken. Then there was the acclaimed fantasy author Greg Maiden, who was found floating in Lake Windermere after going missing during a fishing trip. At first, it was assumed that their deaths were accidental, but as the number of dead writers soared, so did the attention of the media, and it was declared that a serial killer was at large, one that solely preyed upon successful authors. The press quickly labeled the killer as the author offer. Marty was on hold. Alan Chambers was refusing to take his calls, and so while a jazz rendition of The Right Stuff entertained him, the receptionist at McCluster and Luster frantically searched for somebody to take his call. Miley Wilson, spoke a voice tinged with apprehension. Ah, at last. Thanks for taking my call. My name is... Yes, I know who you are, Mr. Murderstorm. You are quite the persistent caller by all accounts. How can I help you today? Marty launched into his sales patter. Picture this, a bold and terrifying tale about how maggots that fell to Earth from space are reanimating the dead. What do you think? Miley sighed. So, you mean to write a zombie novel? Not just any zombie novel. The zombie novel. You see, it's all about the maggots from space. They are radioactive and bring the dead back to life while they feast on them. Sort of like tiny puppet masters. Do you see? I see a zombie novel. Another zombie novel. But this one is different because of the maggots, yes, I know, said Miley, interrupting. Look, the major problem with your genre of choice is that horror is kind of already taken. And what I mean by that is you have Simon Dukes, who almost has the entire horror audience to himself. I'm afraid there's just no room for someone with your, talent. Simon Dukes was a master of dark fiction. Crowned the Duke of Horror, he had penned such greats as Cassie, The Shimmering and That. His novel count stretched into the high 30s, and his work had inspired a generation of authors and filmmakers alike. When it came to market dominance, it was the Duke who sat at the top of the horror tree. So you see, Miley continued, you are always going to be up against him, and frankly, nobody with an interest in horror reads anyone but him. You are a no-go, I'm afraid. Perhaps try your hand at fan fiction and self-pub. Marty hung up. He had heard enough. There was no way he was going to lower himself to writing fan fiction for a living. He had a heart for horror, a dark heart that beat with a defiant thud. If the Duke was stifling all of the competition, perhaps it was time to stifle the Duke. And Simon Dukes was a tall, slight, bespectacled man. If you didn't know your horror, and you passed him on the street, you could easily mistake him for someone worthy of little note. To look at his outward appearance is to miss the might of the person, for within him worked an imagination so vivid that he had been cited as the greatest storyteller of the modern age. Simon was happy with that accolade and quietly continued to churn out a steady stream of novels. Some of his critics argued that his best stories had already been told, but a book with his name on the cover was a guaranteed sell, and talk of unit sales soon hushed any mutterings of a loss of form. There came a knock on his study door, followed by the entrance of his personal assistant, Grace. "Sorry to interrupt, Simon. I've an English journalist on the phone wanting to talk to you." Simon closed his laptop and took off his glasses. Even without them, he could tell that Grace looked fabulous today. "What's the name?" "Ernest Gamal. Does that name sound familiar?" Simon shook his head. "No. How did he get my number?" "No idea," shrugged Grace. "But he's pushing for an interview. He gave me a list of credentials a mile long. I can check them out if you like." "No, it's okay. Pass them to me. I'll have a look through." "English, you say? I've got a book release coming up soon. Couldn't hurt to get my face in the UK press again." Grace nodded. "It is a little quiet on the promotional front. Shall I arrange a phone call?" "Have him come over here. If he is legit, his agency won't mind the airfare. Say next Wednesday, $11 a.m. Grace nodded again and disappeared into her office. Something about the name of the journalist irked Simon. It swam in and out of his consciousness, vying for his attention. Perhaps Ernest, the English journalist, could meet a grisly end in my next book. Recognizing this to be the seed of an idea, he closed the news site that he had been reading. After all, the last thing he wanted on his mind, when trying to write, was the news that there was a serial killer at large who only targeted successful authors. Marty knocked on the large oak double doors and waited. The house was bigger than he had imagined. Photographs taken from the fringes of the property and posted online really did not convey the sheer size of the place. This was a man who had truly made a success of his writing. Marty shook the fuzz from his head and popped a handful of caffeine pills into his mouth. The flight had been long, and he knew he needed his wits about him if he was to kill the Duke in his own home. The door opened, and there stood Simon Dukes, wearing a beige jumper and a pair of black sweatpants. "Mr. Gamal, I presume?" Marty swallowed the pills and thrust his hand towards the man in the black sweatpants, who denied him the chance of literary greatness. Indeed. Call me Ernie, please. Wow, Simon Dukes is shaking my hand. Who'd have thought it?" Simon withdrew his hand and regarded the journalist. "Who indeed? Please come in." Ernie pushed past Simon and entered the grand hallway. "This way, please," said Simon, frowning. "We'll conduct the interview in my study, if that's okay." "Of course," said Marty, taking in his lavish surroundings. "Wherever you feel most comfortable. Tell me, are you in alone?" "As it happens, I am," replied Simon, and he ushered Marty into his study. "My PA is in town. She should be back shortly after lunch." Simon took a seat behind his desk and folded his hands together. "Are you ready to begin?" Sure am, replied Marty. Simon shot Marty a puzzled look. Are you sure? You don't seem to have a notepad or anything to hand. It all goes in here, said Marty, tapping his head. I've an excellent memory. Don't worry. I'll get it all word for word. Simon smiled. If you say so. Where shall I begin? Did you have any questions in mind? Perhaps relating to my new book? Marty's eyes darted around the office, looking for a quick escape. His stomach had knotted, and he suddenly felt sick. Being in the presence of greatness had made him unsure of himself. This wasn't an old dear who wrote about pansies for a living. This was the Duke. All the plans he had made in his head on the flight over about how to kill Simon bled and muddied into one another. Now he wasn't sure he wanted to kill him. Never mind if he even could. Sure, tell me about that, said Marty, his voice hoarse. Simon stood, the smile disappearing from his face. You seem a little nervous. Tell you what, I'll fix you something to drink. How does that sound? Marty nodded and realized that he was sweating. Just a water, please. Coming up, I'll be right back. As the door closed behind Simon, Marty grabbed at his tie and loosened it. I can hardly breathe in here. What's the matter with me? The office was large and airy, with a window that overlooked a vast front lawn and an extravagant water fountain. The wall to the left of him was lined with books. He noted with disappointment that none of his titles numbered among them. Simon returned, carrying a glass of water, which he handed to Marty. Try that. It should fix you right up. Cheers, said Marty, taking a sip, bottoms up. Simon smiled as he retook his seat and turned his attention to his laptop screen. So, I did a little digging around online to see who you had written about previously. Oh? Said Marty, suddenly feeling lightheaded. It seems that I am your first real interview, Mr. Gumall. Would that be correct? Marty tried to raise his hand, but the effort was beyond him. His head dropped, and his chin rested on his chest. That's not so, is what he wanted to say, but what emerged from his throat was a low groaning sound. Simon rose from his chair and grabbed Marty by the hair, forcing his head backward. He leaned in close and whispered, I know who you are. That was the last thing Marty had heard before he blacked out. The sound of humming and beeping filled Marty's head as he gently came to. His eyes fluttered open, and he found himself looking up at a fluorescent light, which hurt his eyes and his head. To his left sat a monitor that was the source of the incessant noise. It seemed to be recording his vital signs, though as he watched the thin green line trace peaks and troughs on the tiny LCD screen, Marty was confused as to why that might be. He tried to sit up, but a great pressure on his chest and arms prevented him from doing so. His head felt as though it was full of cotton wool, and he had begun to notice a dull ache in his groin. He heard a door open to his right and turned his head to see Simon enter the room. There were no windows and only one door. Marty's pulse quickened, and the monitor beeped and chirped, noting his rising fear. He tried to speak, but his tongue felt fat and heavy. Awake at last, I see, began Simon. I guess the procedure took it out of you. Mind you, it did take much longer than I had at first anticipated. Marty tried to speak again, but could only manage a nonsensical, guttural noise. I guess that's the thing with research. Until you do something for yourself, you will never know how long something like that takes, or indeed, what emotions it inspires within you. The door to Marty's right opened again, and he heard a female voice, light and matter-of-fact. He survived the procedure then? Yes, he did. You did a great job bandaging him up, replied Simon. Honestly, I thought we'd lost him, what with the amount of blood he pumped out onto the floor. If you need any suturing or IV packs, give me a shout, okay? Of course, Grace. Thank you. Marty heard the door close and the retreat of rapid-heeled footsteps. After lingering upon the door for a while, Simon returned his attention to the screen, monitoring Marty's vital signs. Yes, you are doing quite well, considering. Marty's groin pain increased sharply, and he let out a mournful cry. Oh, you want to know what I've done to you? I suppose you are aware enough to appreciate my labor now. Hold on, said Simon, disappearing out of the room. He returned moments later, carrying 2 large, badly wrapped pieces of bloodied meat. You see, I figured out who you are, continued Simon. He placed one of the hunks of meat onto the floor and began to unwrap the other. That's the thing about writing horror. You see things in people that most don't. Of course, I checked your non-existent credentials, and I saw the reports on the internet. He paused and looked at Marty. You are the killer who targets authors, am I right? Marty tried to protest his innocence, but his tongue still refused to work. The pain in his groin had become so intense, he was close to blacking out again. Simon continued with the unwrapping of the meat. No matter, I know it was you. I had to take certain measures to contain you. I hope you forgive me. One cannot be too careful with a killer in the house. As the last of the wrapping fell to the floor, Simon held up the meat for Marty to see. It was a leg, one of Marty's legs. Marty's cries caught in his throat. His heart thundered, and his groin screamed. Simon tossed the leg aside and leaned in close. It's amazing what you can accomplish with a hacksaw and a bit of effort. You won't believe this, but the blade cut through bone as though it were butter. But this does mean that you won't be going anywhere now. Nobody knows you are here, and nobody is going to miss you. I've done the world a favor keeping you here. I'm going to make an educated guess. You write, don't you? Blink once for no, twice for yes. Through a veil of sweat and tears, Marty blinked twice. Good. I figured as much. Why else would you target authors who had experienced the success that you craved so dearly? Simon placed a firm hand on Marty's shoulder. Never fear, my friend. I have great plans for you. For us. Over the next few months, Simon Dukes experienced a purple patch, the likes of which no author could hope ever to emulate. Book after the book hit the shelves, and his fans lapped them up in their thousands. His critics were astounded, and though they did not much care for the tale of the demonic octopus that terrified visitors to a small-town aquarium, nor did they appreciate another zombie novel, even if it did contain space maggots, none could argue that they were experiencing the renaissance of a true master at work.
For context, I am a middle-aged man who lives on the outskirts of Parbold, a small English village. My house is the only one on a long, winding country road, but it does have a bus stop. From my bedroom window, I can see it on the other side of the road. It's quite handy, really. I never miss the morning bus to work, and I know the schedule by heart. That's why I was bewildered when I first noticed the 3:17 a.m. bus on Saturday, 14th of October. It woke me up, actually. I'm a light sleeper. I sat upright in my bed, twisted my body around, propped myself up on my knees, and gingerly inched the curtains open. The old lamppost on my road illuminated an ominous, fully gray, non-branded, single-decker bus. There was no interior lighting. I couldn't see a driver or any passengers. Now, this was obviously bizarre. Buses don't show up at that time in the morning. Not in this country, not in any town or city I know anyway. Still, I assumed, as any person would, that times were changing. It seemed like a good idea. A bus for those who've missed the last train home after a night out, perhaps? That still didn't entirely make sense because very few people use my bus stop. It's a 10-minute walk from here to anywhere. I checked the schedule. Nothing. There was a bus at 11:07 p.m. on Friday evening, and there shouldn't have been another one until 6:05 a.m. on Saturday morning. I watched the vehicle pull away and considered perhaps that it wasn't a public bus. Maybe it was a hired coach. That seemed like a reasonable explanation. I put it out of my mind and went back to sleep. However, it returned the next morning, and it continued to do so for weeks. Again, I checked the schedule. Still no mention of a 3:17 a.m. bus. I called the council, and they assured me that it wasn't a public bus. They said that I could contact the local authorities to report any suspicious activity. So I rang the police. They didn't care. They passed me over to some civil department with a forgettable name, and that department passed me over to another department. Nobody was concerned. It became clear that each person I contacted just wanted me to tire of the whole thing and stop bothering them. I gave up on seeking help, but I didn't give up on my quest for an answer. I started making notes. The bus always arrived at exactly 3:17 a.m. It would linger for approximately 30 seconds. Nobody ever boarded or departed the vehicle. I took a picture of it and posted it on various forums. Nobody could identify the origin of the faceless gray bus, but one comment did stand out. I remember a user telling me that I should sell my house and move. They said that the bus was there for me. Most importantly, they said that I shouldn't, under any circumstances, board it. That seemed like a rather obvious piece of advice. I wasn't planning on boarding a sketchy, unlisted bus in the pitch-black hours of the morning. But everything changed on 20th November. The bus arrived on time, 3:17 a.m. I knelt on my bed and peeked at it through the curtain as it rounded the corner. Something was different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Once the vehicle had rolled to a complete stop, I heard it. Somebody on the bus was screaming. I froze. I didn't know what to do. Silence followed, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew I'd heard that scream. I watched the bus and waited. 30 seconds passed. A lot of time passed. When I finally peeled my eyes from the road to check my phone, it was 3:29 a.m. The bus hadn't moved. The world outside was still eerily quiet. I reattached myself to reality and started dialing 999. The call kept failing, and then I saw that I had no signal. None. I usually had signal at the house. I was freaking out, so I got up to turn on my bedroom light. Nothing. I flicked the switch back and forth. No power. The story was the same throughout the house. I was about to head to the fuse box, but I looked out of my living room window to see a blackened world. The lamppost was dead. It had to be a power cut. That was when I finally understood, for the first time in my 10 years of solitary living, that I was truly isolated. I had no neighbors, no friends, no family. I was all alone. The gravity of the situation dawned on me. I would have to leave the house. My self-preservation instinct was to stay indoors, but I couldn't ignore the disembodied scream that had echoed through the night. I knew it had come from the bus. I knew I couldn't live with myself if I were to dismiss it. Armed with a winter coat and a wind-up torch, I bravely ventured into the night, locking my door behind me. I tentatively strolled down my front path, stopping at the gate to cast the torchlight onto the other side of the road. It revealed the gray, stationary, seemingly abandoned bus. There were no signs of life. Everything was so quiet. I swore to myself that I could hear my heartbeat in my eardrums. I swung the creaky gate open and began to cross the road, futilely attempting to steady my quaking knees. My torch wobbled in my shaky left hand, so I clasped my wrist with my right hand. I shone the light into the windows of the parked vehicle. There was definitely no driver, but it was an elevated coach, so I couldn't see whether there were any passengers. I walked around the front of the vehicle, summoning the courage to enter it. When I reached the other side of the bus, I stood still. I tried to control my breathing. I eyed the doors for what seemed an eternity, and then I felt my entire body clench. The doors opened. My torchlight still wasn't revealing a driver. I couldn't see or hear anyone. I thought for a brief moment of that internet stranger who told me not to board the bus, but I couldn't get the scream out of my head. My gut told me that somebody was in danger. I stepped onto the bus and started to climb the stairs. The doors closed. I held the torch before me as if it were a weapon, and I gradually climbed the next set of stairs to the elevated passenger platform. I spent several seconds on each step, savoring what I felt could be my final moments on Earth. Then, I illuminated the passenger area before me. I half expected to see nothing. No, there was somebody on the bus. The young girl was sitting in the middle seat of the back row. Her head was in her palms. She was crying. I couldn't see her face. "Are you okay?" I asked timidly. No answer. So, I started to walk forwards. I didn't know whether there was anyone else on board, but I couldn't leave her. Once I was standing only a few yards in front of her, I knelt down in the aisle. "Are you okay?" I asked a second time. The girl's crying abruptly ceased, but she didn't lift her head from her hands. "You shouldn't have boarded the bus," she replied. My torch died. I furiously wound the lever at the side, but it didn't spring back to life. The girl and I had been plunged into darkness. Then I heard the bus doors open. I slowly turned my head to face the front of the bus. I could hear the sound of low, guttural breathing. It was followed by clunking footsteps. Dim moonlight shone through the front window, but it was sufficient to display a hulking figure at the other end of the aisle. A black specter with gangly limbs was moving towards us. He was hunched forwards, and his elongated arms dragged along the tops of the seats. He was too tall and too wide to fit in the aisle. I turned to face the girl. She had lifted her head from her hands. I could barely see her. I could barely hear her. "This is the last stop," she whispered. "I was really hoping you wouldn't board. I wanted more time." Before I could even comprehend what was happening, I felt an icy limb coil itself around my ankle. It yanked, and I fell. My nose connected with the floor of the aisle, and I heard something crack. I thought that was it. I thought that was the end. But I looked up to see the demonic creature coil its other limb around the girl's neck. It hoisted her from her seat. She screamed as she was lifted towards the indistinguishable figure in the aisle. I couldn't really see what happened in the darkness, but I'll never forget the sound her body made when it was consumed by the black entity. It sounded like leaves crunching beneath walking boots. I had almost entirely lost my sense of reality at this point, but some vestige of survival instinct persisted in my fractured mind. I twisted onto my back and looked down at my ankle. I couldn't really see what I was doing in the dark. I just knew I had to act. So with my free foot, I stamped on the creature's limb. I stamped as hard as humanly possible. The demon, which had been devouring the poor girl, unleashed an inhuman wail. It pierced my eardrums and shattered every window on the bus. The limb retracted from my ankle and returned to the shadowy being. I seized my opportunity. Catapulting to my feet, I spun around and lunged for the now glassless back window of the bus. Clinging to the frame of the window for dear life, I took one last look at the dark entity that was hurtling towards me. Then, I dropped to my feet on the road. I sprinted away from the bus. Adrenaline fueled me onwards. I didn't look back. I just kept running. At the speed I traveled, I think it only took me a few minutes to reach the warm and welcoming lights of civilization. I looked at my phone and cried when I saw that I had service. I booked a taxi. I wanted the farthest possible destination. I chose Manchester, then I took the first train to London. For the past couple of weeks, I've been living in a hotel. I know I was a little late, but I finally took the advice of that online stranger. I moved away. I moved far away. I don't go outside at night, and I definitely don't look out of the window after 3 a.m.
The man entered his front door to the melody of groaning hinges and his weary footsteps. He shut the door and set his keys on the kitchen table, the weight of his 9-to-5 responsibilities melting away as he did. The front door of his home opened into a small, narrow kitchen. It narrowed further into a hallway that led past the cellar door on the right. At the end of the hallway, just past the cellar, the space turned into an ascending staircase. His home wasn't small, but its design and use of space was ill-conceived and older than he was by at least a decade or more. His lower back hurt from being on his feet for hours at a time, and his hands were still dirty from his day job. The noise from the cellar was back again. He exhaled with frustration, irritated that the reminder couldn't have waited for him to grab a cola from the fridge and sit for a while. It was insistent, pleading for his attention, and despite his other daily duties, he knew it couldn't wait another night. He'd have to fix the problem now. The tall man moved down the hallway to the cellar door. He stopped at the mirror he had mounted just on the right side of the door and looked at himself for a moment. He liked having a mirror near the front door so he could check his appearance before leaving, but at that moment he hated it for what it showed him. Hooded brown eyes looked back at him, weary and haunted with age and exhaustion. Dark circles and ever more noticeable lines made his face appear ancient in the half-lit corridor. He had salt and pepper whiskers from not shaving that week, and the graying hair at his temples was getting long and unruly again. He had been clipping his hair since he had turned 22, rather than trying to hide the male pattern baldness that had begun to take hold so dismally early in his life. He maintained an air of youth and exuberance despite his aging features, but today he was feeling his years more acutely than ever, and the mirror reflected that truth. He stared for a moment longer at the tired and worn-looking face that stared back at him, and at that moment he mourned for his lost youth. The door to the cellar whined in complaint, its creaking hinges aching with age. The top two steps were no better, moaning with the wear and tear of decades as they supported his weight. He sighed again. They needed to be replaced soon before they broke beneath his step, especially the second one. He could drive to the store that minute and buy the single piece of lumber he'd need to fix, and that would be the end. He had the tools, the nails, and the know-how to replace it easily, but his back pain flared, and the insistent noise was still demanding his attention downstairs. A third weary sigh escaped him. He didn't have the energy to fix both today. He descended slowly, his steps halted and stiff from the pain. He flipped the light switch at the bottom, and he was greeted with the familiar sight of the cement walls and floor of the basement. The old support beams towards the back of the cellar were musty and cobwebbed, and his tools were everywhere from the project he had been working on. The occasional drip of moisture could be heard, and the cool air was thick with the smell of his labors. He stretched, arching his back and groaning yet again. He looked where the noise was coming from. He needed his wrench. The noise kept rising and falling as he searched the table where he last remembered seeing it. It was time to replace it. His skills couldn't keep it running much longer anyway. The wrench he needed was on the floor underneath the table. Spending so much time down here fixing things lately had become tiresome and didn't quite bring him the joy it used to. He moved to the opposite table, wiping the sweat away from his brow as he did. This was going to be another exhausting night. Next to the table, his apron hung by a thick nail in the beam overhead, his work gloves tucked neatly in the front chest pocket. He slipped the apron over his head and tied it around his waist. The rubber gloves went on next, thick and smooth against his skin. He laced his fingers and worked the gloves snugly down to the webs. The large wrench was difficult to grasp in the thick gloves, but he could hold it well enough. He gripped the wrench in his left hand and placed his right hand on the wheezing mechanism. In 2 quick motions, he raised the wrench and brought it down hard on his victim's face. The second swing brought the wrench down hard on the eye socket, collapsing it and finally ending the incessant noise. Teeth broke as the wrench connected with sickening force and blood sprayed his apron. The man set the wrench aside and took a moment to look over the body, so much to do now. He noticed the utility knife near the body, still within reach, having been used last night to remove the eyelids. That had been quite interesting. Of all the mechanisms he brought home to dismantle, he had, as of yet, never seen the eye without the skin surrounding it. It gave the head a strange appearance, making the eyes look like they were popping out. That had kept his attention for a while. It was time. He was done with this one and would get new components in a couple of weeks, or perhaps a month or 2, depending on how he felt after some downtime. He'd been considering taking a break for some time. For now, he needed to disassemble this device and dispose of it. He looked at all the work he had put in. Broken joints, seared flesh, and large muscle groups missing sizable portions were all evident as he inspected the results of his methodical destruction. The genitals were first. He severed them and plopped them in a waiting pickling jar placed on the shelf. The scalp came next. He cleaned it and draped it over an old hat rack to dry, looking forward to adding the strawberry blonde mop to the long house coat made of other scalps that he wore when he was alone during cold winter days at home. He made surgical cuts he learned from watching autopsy videos to help the blood drain a bit better. He knew his clumsy attempts couldn't compare to those of a surgeon or coroner, but for someone completely untrained in the medical profession, he felt like he had become somewhat of a skilled amateur after all his practice. He picked up his scattered tools as the blood pooled in the bucket at the end of the table. He grabbed his fillet knife after organizing the space and began taking his choice strips of skin from the chest and thighs. He was making decent progress on the wall behind him. A few more of this size would have the whole wall covered. Then he could begin on the other walls. After removing the head and putting it in the preservation jar, he placed it on the shelf next to the others. Soon he'd need another shelf, or he would just have to stop keeping the heads. He liked the heads. They reminded him of all the hard work he had done over the years. The intestines came next. He cut a length free, emptied it, and threw it around his neck as he performed his best Cruella de Vil impression, swaying and prancing around his workspace while smoking a pretend cigarette and swinging the grotesque boa to and fro. He laughed a little as he took it off and threw it into the large plastic bin with the remaining organs to be incinerated. He finished up and sealed the last of the bins with their lids. He put the choice cuts of meat he had selected in the deep freezer and began cleaning the rest of the clutter and scraps left over. It took a while, but the man felt a triumphant accomplishment as the bone fragments and the last of the solid pieces were finally scooped up and tossed into the old incinerator. He'd burn the rest after dinner once the first batch of solids had been reduced to ash. He walked over to the spigot under the stairs and grabbed the attached hose. He whistled an old sea shanty as he sprayed down his work area. He let the hose fall from his hands, grabbed the Tupperware that held the lever, and headed upstairs. He flipped the light off and climbed the steps, happy to be done with his work for the night. As he approached the top of the stairs, he tried to remember if he still had onions and garlic for dinner, when unexpectedly a loud crack of splintering wood resounded through the basement, and his leg plunged into the hole left by the broken step. He yelped as he plummeted, caught off guard by the sudden plunge. Pain shot through his leg and groin as the splintered wood stabbed into him, and rusted nails gouged him deep along his inner thigh. He screamed as he tried to lift himself. There was a large splinter of wood embedded deep in his groin, just to the left of his genitals. It was deeper than he thought. He could feel it stabbing into the soft innards just inside his pelvic area. Blood ran freely from his leg. He could hear it splashing on the floor below him. He must have opened an artery. Panic set in. He struggled to lift himself, despite his agony, desperate to escape and stem the bleeding. The pain was excruciating. The deep wounds along his thigh sent hot flares of damage signals to his brain. Was he going to die like this, alone and awkwardly impaled on a piece of splintery, dirty old wood sticking out of the stairs? Was this ignoble end all his hard work had earned him? His struggling lessened as his strength bled away with his life. He slumped, unable to keep his body up and off the hardened splinter of wood that impaled him. Numb and cold overcame him as the offending piece of stairs stabbed a few more inches from his dead weight. In the last moments of his life, as the blood splashing below grew to a slow drip and the darkness in his vision closed in, he cursed himself bitterly. He should have just fixed the goddamn step. The darkness enveloped him and he was gone. Days later, his neighbors reported the smell and the police came. They found his body on the steps and would eventually make their way down into the basement after extracting him. Bins full of bones, organs, and meat would be discovered, much to the horror of the investigating officers, and the nearly covered wall of skin almost drove them all from the basement en masse. Teeth found in the incinerator and tattoos on the wall would help identify some of those whose heads he had not collected and put on display. 2 senior police sergeants would seek counseling after the initial investigation, and 1 rookie officer simply left the scene after throwing up and turned in his badge the next day. The officer had only been on the job for about 4 months. Over time, the house would gain infamy as the flesh pit of Pittsburgh, and eventually it would be demolished by request of the bank that owned the deed to Barnabas Stumper's home. They never even tried to sell it. As for Barnabas Stumper, he would forever be known to the world as the Beast of Sailor Street, the prolific serial murderer who callously butchered over 42 people in his basement and made a macabre mural of their skin on the cold cement wall. That was Stumper's secret, which he had expertly hidden for years, a secret that had only been revealed after a sudden death that he had nearly avoided had he only replaced that fateful step.